afternoon, everyone. My name is Prakangshit Moore, and I'm the manager for the Regional's Alumni Program at York University. It is my pleasure to be your host and moderator for today's panel that is Working Abroad. I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone in attendance today. We have some attendees who have been to level up sessions in the past, and some who may be attending their first level up session. For those of you attending for the first time, the Level Up event series is a program that invites alumni leaders to help new grads navigate life and work after getting their degree. The series covers everything from professional networking to career development and life skills. Before we get started, I want to begin by offering York's land acknowledgement. Although we aren't all in the same location, we recognize many indigenous nations have long standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been taken care by Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. If at any time you need help with this experience or have questions about the content, feel free to click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. A team is ready to help you. Thank you. And now I'm honored to introduce you to our alumni speakers, Mark Capricio, Nancy Patterson, and Stephanie Martin. Panelists, please turn on your cameras and join me on our virtual stage. We are now going to do a round of self-introductions. Please share your current role, what you studied at York, and your fondest memories of student life. Mark, I guess you can start with this one.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much. Pleasure to be here and join my fellow panelists, Nancy and Stephanie. My name is Mark Caporicio. As you mentioned, PS, he, him pronouns. I graduated in 2011 with two undergrads, Bachelor's of Arts in Communications and Sociology, and that what's now known as the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. I also graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Primary Junior Education from the Faculty of Ed as part of the concurrent ed program there. And in my current role, well, I serve as the Global Diversity Lead of Early Talent Acquisition, also known as Campus Recruitment for RBC Capital Markets. And in this role, I manage all of our diversity recruitment programs and partnerships. And I do that in collaboration with our teams in the UK, the US, and Canada. I'm currently based in our London, England office, although I was born and raised in Toronto myself. Highlight of my student experience would definitely be getting involved on campus. From my first year, I plugged into, Frosh Week, orientation residence life. I was a Don at Founders College. Props to any FU Founders alum or Founders United students. And I also served as the president of the Founders College Student Council in undergrad as well. So a lot of really treasured memories working with students and administrators and faculty in my undergrad.
That's quite a fascinating work that you've been doing, Mark. And I really love your memory coming from the first week itself when you were on campus. That says a lot about. Next up, we go to Nancy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nancy Patterson, and I graduated from York also twice. So I did my BA in psychology, graduated in 2010, and that following September, I went right back to that Kiel campus to do my JD at Osgoode Hall Law School. I'm currently a client manager at American Express. I represent our largest construction and commercial industrial suppliers. And my fondest memory of York is probably meeting my husband at Osgood. We moved to New York, a couple years after graduating together, which I'm sure we'll get into later. And now we live in Park Slope, Brooklyn with our 2-year-old.
That's amazing. You're impacting your life so much that you find your
Yeah.
life partner. I feel like York has had that impact on a lot of lives. Next up, we have Stephanie.
Thank you. My name is Stephanie Martin. I graduated from York with a Bachelor of Arts majoring in sociology, sounds familiar, a minor in history, and a certificate in law and society. So we're all sort of related to each other somehow in our education journey, it seems. I then went on to do a postgraduate in corporate communications, which was the springboard for my career. I started in brand communications and public relations in Toronto, and that eventually took me stateside to Chicago, Dallas, and now Los Angeles. And I was one of those commuter students who was privileged enough to have York University in the my backyard of my hometown. So I'm happy to share that experience along the way. But I think one of my fondest memories was being able to keep and retain the same friendships I had from elementary school all the way through university graduation. I'm looking forward to sharing and answering all the questions you all have today.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And hearing about your journey, I see you have traveled across East, West, and I think so Central US by now. So I think so you have a lot to tell to our attendees today. So thank you so much for those introductions, everyone. Let's move into our panel discussion. And I'll start with the questions which have been pre-submitted by our attendees, and we'll go about them. And then we also move into a Q&A session after that. So the first question that I have is, what inspired you to work outside of Canada? And also, there any specific experiences that led you to this particular decision? Nancy, maybe you can start with this one.
Yeah, it's pretty funny, I think, how I ended up here because I was one of those people who grew up in Toronto, loved Toronto, all my friends, my family, and I had no desire to leave. And honestly, I still think Toronto is probably the greatest city to grow up in, near and dear to me. I decided that, I wanted to further my education, so I got my MBA in New York. And at the time, I was actually looking at business schools in Canada, specifically Toronto. And I had a good friend who said, like, hey, um, the world is big. If you're looking for business schools, like you might think about going to the US. So that's when I first started looking at programs outside of Canada, decided to apply and enroll. And my goal was always to finish my degree and come back home. So, after graduating, I'm sort of, again, a little bit peer pressured into, hey, you're already here, you get like a year like free visa from having your MBA in the US. Why not, use that visa, just try it out for a year, and then you can always go home. Toronto will always be there. So I did that. And then my husband said, well, why don't we just stay for 5 years and then we'll go back? We can just get a little bit more work experience. It's sort of like, if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. And I said, okay, let's stay a couple more years. I am enjoying myself here. I love the energy of the city. And then the pandemic happened, and it was actually hard to even consider moving anywhere. Not even thinking about coming back to a different country. Then we had a daughter, and now, 7 years later, I'm still in New York, and I think we're going to be here for the foreseeable future. I mean, I think people tend to have a little bit more of a planned strategy of where they're going and how they're going to stay, but sometimes life just sort of takes you from one milestone to another until, you have a toddler living in Brooklyn.
Absolutely. Life just happens, and it has a way for you to find a place wherever you are, and you make a place. I think so. Even me as an international student who came to Toronto, never thought that I would stay back. And here I am working at the university itself. So I completely get when it comes to oh, I'll move back in this much time. This is my timeline, and life happens. I absolutely can. Thank you, Nancy, for sharing that. Stephanie, up to you.
Sure. So I always had an interest in working stateside, particularly because of the industry that I fell into. And truth be told, I was enamored by the Hollywood of it all. But it was a fork in the road in my career that motivated the move. I was doing really well at work, but I hit a ceiling in my growth. The agency that I was working at had a global footprint and they offered relocation opportunities based on business needs. And I had a really, really great manager who found the opportunity and advocated for me. And I was able to make an internal transfer to our Chicago office, and the rest was history.
Absolutely. Having a great team which sees your aspirations as their own and help you grow, I think so. That's amazing to have for oneself. I'm great it worked out for you. Uh, Mark, anything from your side to add on this?
Some similar themes, I think, in my experience. Like Stephanie, I think in high school, we did an interest aptitude test one day in our careers class in Toronto. And it was very clear that, like, I was interested in international careers at that point, and that was really coming through in the test. And so I always had it in the back of my mind as well. So at York, I was able to take advantage of a study abroad, and that also opened up my mind to, how easy it is for people to work and study and live internationally. Um, like Nancy, I actually pursued a master's in New York. So that was my first foray into studying and working abroad, because with my program, you had to work part-time while studying. And it was great. And that exposed me to life in the Big Apple, as they say. And I loved it. I wasn't sure if it was going to, be the best fit for me, but I just jumped head first into the culture and energy of New York City. Unfortunately, my visa was coming to an end, and that's where, like Stephanie, I benefited from an incredible manager who also advocated for me and made it possible for me to stay with the company, but relocate to London. So yeah, I know we'll get into visa trials and tribulations later on, but that was my interest. It came from a high school kind of level of wanting to explore what's out there in the world, and it was specifically a master's program in the States that kind of initiated this kind of free-flowing international career.
That's fascinating how things fell in place and how you've touched upon a few of the points that we have questions ready for. And I'll just pick up straight up from there. As Mark, you pointed out the visa requirements and how you have to take into considerations of different rules and regulations when you're first doing that. So my next question goes into uh, straight up to you. Can you share your experience with the visa application and the legal requirements and any advice for those who are navigating this experience right now?
Oh, yeah. So PS, I'll keep this brief because this could be a whole hour, right? I'm sure we all have stories, but basically, I benefited from a student visa, like Nancy. I was able to work, I think it was for 2 years post-graduation from the master's program in the States. And so that allowed me to recruit essentially for jobs. And now I have a bit of a funny story. So I met someone who worked at a bank in New York, and we struck up a mentor relationship. It kind of happened organically. And he, came to see, I was, full of energy, ambition, and, wanted to do anything that the bank would offer. And he referred me for a position. I was fast-tracked to an interview. Long story short, got the job. And I remember the recruiter calling me after I had signed on the dotted line and said, "Mark, please tell me you're not Canadian." And I said, "Well, actually, I am." I made that clear in my entire process. I wasn't hiding that aspect of my background. she said, okay, we're just gonna have to amend the offer letter, is what she said. And so she basically had to add a line that I'm, as long as I'm eligible to work in the States, I can hold the job. But as I mentioned earlier, I actually wasn't able to work in the US after 2 attempts at the H-1B visa lottery. So again, very grateful to my employer for having done that. Now, this is kind of going to be a theme in my story of, if you show what you're made of, with these opportunities, and, people come to see what you're capable of, and, they believe in you, and you have the work ethic and the attitude, the energy, they will try to move mountains to make your dreams possible. And I found that in the early stages of my career. So the company paid for the H-1B visa lottery application twice. I didn't get it the first time, but we found a loophole. I was able to enroll in a part-time MBA program, which gave me another year of work authorization in the States. And that extended my stay so they could submit another visa lottery. As I mentioned, it was unsuccessful, but the company transferred me to the London office. So I was able to take advantage of the youth mobility scheme. I think it's called Tier 1 or something like that. If you're 30 or younger at the time of application and you're a Commonwealth citizen, then you can apply for that and work in, I think, any industry except for dentistry. And I think you can't be a doctor or a dentist. Oh, no, it was a lawyer and a dentist. That's right. So anyway, there were global restructures at the company. I was then out of a job, and I hadn't lived in Canada for 5 years. So I returned to Canada, joined the Toronto team for RBC. And it was my old manager at that bank in New York who called me. She ended up joining RBC in the US and said, "Mark, I'm growing up my team. I want you on it. Would you like to come back to New York?" I said, "Absolutely, let's go." So at that point, I went across the border on a transfer visa, inter-office transfer visa. So my manager and I joke that we've worked every sort of visa there is in my career. And really it was her support that helped explore that option, because obviously there is a financial component to these applications as well. Anyway, sorry for hogging the mic there.
No. Absolutely. That's very fascinating. I didn't even know that the amount of visas that there can be applied to find a certain loophole. I think so. That's really helpful for few of our attendees who are looking for, okay, I have already done this one. How can I get more? I'll throw the question to Stephanie now. Stephanie, as you have traveled throughout US, and I hope you have stories for us to know about.
I think all of us who've had to cross a border and get something stamped with a government official have half a dozen stories that are part of our repertoire. But to echo what Mark was saying, that there are many different kinds of visas that exist, and each have nuances to them. And some are limited and have a finite length. And then they expire. And then there are others that allow you more time and can be renewed and eventually allow you to apply for a green card. In my experience, I came over on an intercompany transfer, like Mark had mentioned at the end of his journey, and that was called an L1B. B is important here because that one had a very finite length of time, which I didn't know. And it was my lawyer who said, "Hey, if you're going to stay or you want to stay, we should move you on to an L1A, because that one's more flexible and you can stay in the country a little bit longer. You can renew it, and it gives you opportunity to move into green card stages later." Great to know. Wouldn't have ever known that in my early stages. And that did allow me to renew and then eventually apply for a green card. So if you are in a position where your company will take care of your visa, you need to know that your employment in that country is conditional on employment with them. That means if you want to take another job, your status will be impacted in that country unless a new company takes over your sponsorship. And it's only once you reach green card level that you have flexibility to move freely and change your career or even seek another job outside of that company. It is an investment. So I would say that if the company can make a great case that it will save the company money because you are a sure thing for that role, it makes it very easy for them to slot you into that role. But know that they're taking the investment on to hire outside counsel and to make and fund your move. Most companies also have relocation policies too, so they offer you money to move from one place to another. That said, there are some highly specialized jobs that qualify for very different visas and conditions, which I am not an expert in. But definitely do not feel shy to ask your employer or the legal team that is assigned about questions and any nuances you should be aware of.
Absolutely. And knowing that little detail about the L1 visa, again, I think so new information for everyone. And that's why I think so lawyers are important in life. And going to the lawyer in this panel that we have, Nancy, what have been your experience on that?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think my experience is very similar to Mark's in the sense that I've basically tried every avenue possible. Very similar to Mark because I did an education in the US, started with the OPT, the optional practical training, which is like that, like, you know, year free. Sometimes you can get 2 years depending on the type of degree that you did. So started off with that. Like Mark, was not successful with the H-1B, despite, you know, multiple attempts, and um, actually applied to a lot of jobs where, you know, when offer time kind of came around, sort of dug into the details. This is back when I think that question, which is very apparent on every US employer's application now, it's, you know, do you now or will you ever need visa or work authorization sponsorship? That question was not standard at the time that I was applying. So there were a lot of instances where I got to like final round or right before offer, and they're talking about like, okay, like when can you start? What's your SSN? All that stuff. And they're like, oh no. So there's definitely a degree of assessing the risk tolerance of a company, right? And the risk is really if they hire you, what are the chances that you cannot get work authorization? So they've essentially wasted all their time doing the interviews, onboarding you. You know, for American Express, there was like a background check that took several weeks. You know, what is their risk tolerance to see, you know, whether this is going to be a path that has sort of no happy ending. For example, I had a really interesting job offer for a nonprofit that represented tech startups in New York City. So essentially, they were like the lobbyists of tech startups in the city. And the role that they had for me, you know, we had even discussed like, hey, we're probably going to need a visa. They were looking at a TN visa for me because, you know, being Canadian, that's one avenue. We were sort of off cycle for H-1B, so it didn't make sense to wait for that. And, you know, I had the degrees that could warrant the management consultant classification, which tends to be a little broader and is also a little bit risky because so many people try to apply under that category of the TN. Got to the board level consideration. So, you know, this association had a board and they said, well, the role that we want to offer her is government sponsored. So the US government was putting funds for the salary of that role. And because of that, they were not comfortable with hiring a foreigner, essentially. They thought that they would get pushback or it would risk their funding for the following year if it appeared that, you know, they were diverting funds from the US to like a foreigner, me. So went through the entire process, did not get the job, was pretty, you know, demoralizing considering how many rounds of interviews I had gone through. I think it was like 7. Eventually found another company, 500-person startup, said, oh yeah, we hire non-US citizens all the time. The company was very used to applying for TNs for Canadians specifically, and didn't blink when I told them that I would need sponsorship. Had a very savvy legal team that said, oh, fly into this port, don't fly into that one. Some border officers tend to be a little bit more stringent than others. And, no problem. Got my TN, worked there until I wanted to switch jobs. And like Stephanie said, depending on the type of visa you're on, if you're on an H-1B visa, you can port that to a different company. The other company has to agree to take that on. But if you have an H-1B, you have it and you can sort of take it with you. If you're on a TN like I was, you can't port a TN. The new company would have to submit a new TN application outlining the responsibilities of the role and how I would qualify for it with my experience and credentials. So I had to go through the exact same thing all over again for the next job. And I think this was April of 2020. So smack dab in the middle of the beginning of the pandemic, I was not flying anywhere. So there's two ways to get a TN for those interested. One, you can present yourself at the border and say, border officer, I'm here for work. This is the job description. This is why I'm qualified. Please give me that stamp in my passport. The other way to do it is you can apply by mail. And when you apply by mail, it does not go to a border officer. It goes to USCIS, so US Citizenship and Immigration. And as you can imagine, the people who are receiving those applications are a little bit more sort of nuanced and detail oriented and also slower because you're applying through mail and they're going to have to mail you a response, or if they need additional information they have to let you know that you need to provide some extra documents. So that was sort of round two of me doing my TN. Then when I wanted to work for American Express, huge company, they have a presence in Canada even, in North York. And they were like, no, you want to be a client manager? That is a really big stretch to see if you can qualify under this management consultant category, which is very broad. And at the time, my husband was actually undergoing his green card process that his company was sponsoring. And again, I've literally been through every kind of work authorization status as a spouse of someone who is getting their green card, and I would be getting mine through him. You can get work authorization while the application is pending once it reaches a certain stage. So I explained to Amex, listen, my TN's not going to transfer to you, but I do have work authorization through my husband's green card process. And eventually I'm going to get my green card too. So you don't have to worry about sponsoring me. Amex being a bank, I'm sure, Mark has sort of experienced similar things. They're very cautious about playing around with any kinds of rules and laws and regulations. Said, okay, well, we are a government contractor. We have to follow every single thing to the letter. And when we posted this job posting, it said that this role is not eligible for sponsorship. Now, if in the event, knock on wood, that your relationship is severed, or for some reason this green card process doesn't go the way that you think for your husband, we would be responsible for finding you work authorization. So they had to retract their job offer, repost the job posting, and edit it to say that it is eligible for work authorization sponsorship, even though typically client management roles are not eligible. Usually they reserve that for, if you're applying for an SVP job or a C-suite job. They had to edit the job posting to say that it was eligible for sponsorship. I reapplied and then got the offer again, even though we kind of all knew that the chances of me actually needing them to step up in that regard was very low. I'm thankful that last year I finally got my green card, so I don't have to worry about this visa problem anymore unless I want to move to Europe like Mark did. And yeah, honestly, I think probably the visa status was the single most stressful and demoralizing part of working in the US. And I think there's a lot of misconception about, oh, you're Canadian, you're right across the border. Like, shouldn't it be easier for you? And I'm like, well, in some ways, yes, because we do have that TN option. And in a lot of ways, no. We are treated as a foreign citizen, a non-US citizen, the same way that anyone would be. So that was very
Absolutely.
long-winded, but that was my
Agree.
experience.
You just brought to mind some some memories that I've like buried deep in my subconscious. But
We all
I
need
love
therapy after this.
is that what this is right now? Exactly. Group therapy session. I will say the risk tolerance piece is huge that you mentioned in terms of companies, enabling some roles to be open for sponsorship. And I just wanted to add that, I think especially for global organizations, it's generally not a blanket yes or no around sponsorship. As you mentioned, Nancy, just then in your examples, like some certain roles tend to be more open for sponsorship than others. And I see it at RBC. I know the other big banks do the same, where some divisions are very open to sponsoring and some are more risk averse. So I think that's important for the students and grads on the line to, when you're doing your coffee chats, informational chats, to dig into a little bit in terms of, what groups are more likely and more open to sponsoring, or have there been any international applicants brought onto the team recently? Those are some of the questions to poke into. And then I also wanted to just mention quickly, I remember, it felt like everything was hinging on the border officer and their stamp. And I remember in my application, like the immigration team, the legal team, they were great, but they made it clear that my case was not, in their words, a slam dunk case. So there were holes that people could poke at, basically. And I don't know why, but I think I lucked out a little bit. I mean, I made sure to wear a suit. I was like looking the part for that visa, but you put your best foot forward. But I got a very friendly officer who was very happy to sign on the dotted line for a Canadian applicant. But that's definitely something that's out of your control, and something that you kind of hope you have an officer on their good day when they're looking at your application. And then lastly, I think the only visa that I didn't explore, it seems, is, kind of marrying one of my friends, right, in the US, which many friends like put forward and said, listen, should we just go to the whatever it is, the town hall, and like sign the paper? And I had professionals like kind of alluding to it as well, like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But then I heard stories of, the immigration officers interviewing these couples and asking, okay, so what side of the sink do they put their toothbrush on? And like these particular specific couples questions that we would never be able to answer. So, there are lots of different routes, basically. And I just wanted to add a little bit of some funny memories to some of the examples that Nancy shared.
There were definitely
No,
days where I turned to my husband, I was like, "Should we just get divorced and marry Americans so we can, like, potentially stay in the country?" But we decided it would be too much paperwork.
Yeah, exactly.
thank you so much for that laugh, and I get it, and thank you, panelists, for the great discussion. I think so. Now we can move forward and take some questions from the audience. And audience members, please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A. As the questions start coming in, I have few more questions which were submitted beforehand, so I'll just straight up go to them. One question, I think so Nancy and Mark, both of you talked about on this as well, and even Stephanie touched upon, is the work culture and the environment. Is like, if you're working hard enough, if you are good enough, the company goes and takes that extra step. So the question comes is, when you first moved or when you were applying for these jobs, did you notice any change in the new culture or the work environment that were a bit difficult to adapt for you, or were a bit different from what you have seen in Canada? I think just Stephanie, you can take this one, and then we'll give the others a chance.
Sure, I'm happy to be filler as the questions start rolling in. So I assumed, as a Canadian, we so much of the same media, pop culture, food. We shopped at the same stores that acclimating to the US would be pretty simple. But some of the things that I spent some time acclimating to were one, the magnitude of the market. It's completely different. I thought I knew how to do my job and well, but all of a sudden everything was bigger and the expectations were higher. And it was actually a total blessing because it took my career to a completely different level as I navigated larger and more complex teams, bigger budgets, and different ways of working. The other thing that I had to acclimate to is that my work style had to change. That thing that we're told about being nice as a Canadian is actually a real thing. I needed to be a lot more direct and decisional and comfortable without saying sorry. I figured out I could still be well liked while also having a firm opinion without saying sorry all the time. And the last thing, it often goes unsaid because it can be a little uncomfortable, but it does play a part into acclimating into your new city or American city, and that's the political landscape. Sometimes American politics can be a spectator sport, especially when you're consuming it from afar. But it's completely different when you're a guest in someone else's country and don't have the same lived experience. And for me, it meant adjusting to what was acceptable workplace conversation, events companies were sponsoring, or what people were attending. And this also further depends on what state or city you're living in. You can imagine how vastly different the experience for me was living in Texas versus living in California. My best advice is spend time listening with a seek to understand mindset. I definitely learned a lot by listening more than necessarily participating.
Absolutely. I completely understand that the cultural changes are something that you need to get acquired to. However well prepared you are, you don't know what life's going to throw at you. Thank you for that answer, Stephanie. So I have a question for Mark. Was the visa application process for UK/Europe way more difficult or less difficult as was your American experience?
Oh, the UK visa was a dream. It was a breeze. And it is pretty much, I don't quote me on this, I'm sure it's online. I don't think it ever meets the quota, right? I think there's always room for applicants. This was I think it's called the Tier 1 or Tier 4 Youth Mobility Scheme, it's called. And that would be for Canadian citizens applying to work in the UK. But I think every Commonwealth nation, examples, Australia, New Zealand also have these visa options for quote unquote youth. I think New Zealand, if I remember correctly, I think New Zealand's age limit is 35 or younger. And I know in the UK it's 30 or younger. But the point is, I mean, it gives young people who are interested in international work experiences, in my opinion, a very straightforward visa option. I think there's obviously a financial application component to it, and it's up to the individual to find housing and find a job, but it gets you to the country and gives you the work authorization. So it's a 2-year work visa, is my understanding. And yeah, I know multiple friends from York actually who took advantage of that early in their career, and some have stayed and some have moved back to Canada.
Thank you so much for that, because explaining how there are different type of visas and how everyone who has a certain citizenship can avail it. I think so that's something all the youth, as you said, should know about. Next one, it's for Nancy. Do you have any tips for people with a JD looking for to get a job in US uh, uh, in the event that they do not want to be a practicing lawyer?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when I was thinking about what kind of roles I was looking for, I was not really looking for legal roles. I did keep it open as an option. So I even went through the trouble of, writing and passing the New York bar just in case I wanted to practice here, or there was some sort of role that was sort of like mixed, right? So like there are definitely roles that have both a business and legal element to it. Ultimately, I didn't apply for any of those roles. I didn't find one that was a very good fit, but I think someone else also asked, like, why didn't I try to get a TN under the legal category? It's much more straightforward, right? It's sort of like, hey, are you eligible to practice law here? Yes. Do you have a law degree? Yes. It would have been much more clear cut because you don't have people going through the trouble of like going through law school and writing the bar just so that they can like maybe get this visa. However, you have to remember that the role has to match the qualifications. So if your role doesn't have a lot of legal responsibility, someone might say like, is this really a legal job, or are you just, a lawyer trying to sort of cheat the system? Um, in terms of getting a non-law job with a JD, honestly, I don't think there's really significantly an advantage of having a JD. I think probably you need to do the same thing as everyone else, right? You need to get your foot in the door. So you're either going to want to do um, post-secondary education in the US so that you can get that OPT of 1 to 2 years, or you're going to do an L1 like Stephanie did and get a transfer, or you're going to start off in legal, go work for a firm or go work in-house, get that JD, TN, and then while you're in that role, look for something else so that you can be sponsored another way that's not connected to your law degree. So yeah, there's no shortcut. There's a path, but it's not going to be something that you can do overnight.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. The next one I have is for Stephanie. Stephanie, you did touch upon it a bit, the change in culture and how you had to network. So, how important was networking in securing opportunities abroad for you? And what strategies, if you may, did you use to build your international and professional network?
So, in my experience moving abroad as an internal transfer within my own company, was just not as complex as seeking to be hired and sponsored by a company net new. But that said, relationships are everything. My networking was a product of the impression I had made on senior management at the time that I would be a good fit for the role and a solid bet to move over instead of hiring somebody net new in that market. And every time I moved to a new city, I went in with a spirit of yes to build my new network. I said yes to every invitation to go out after work for dinners, to join. And I really did use my work colleagues as my springboard for establishing those initial couple of months as I was getting settled in, asking people, well, where do people live? Where's the hairdresser that you go to? What's the great dentist? Just getting a little bit of a touch point before I was ready to spread my own wings and try things on my own. If you happen to be passionate about an organization that you're already part of at home, there's often local chapters that you can look into your new city if those are things that you want to continue doing and speak to your heart. And then there's always the fun of trying something new. I often try to make a list like every 6 to 12 months to try something new and keep expanding my community, because there's often something unique in the city or the location that I'm in. In Los Angeles, I mean, living from one end of the city to the other, it's like living in a completely different place. So really just trying to dig in and finding things that speak to me has worked out well, because I keep learning something new about where I live.
Thank you so much. And it's very important. Few of our attendees would also know this, that we have international chapters for our York alum as well. You can connect with them, and they also help you. Mark, being one of our major volunteers for our UK network, and it's been lovely to have been working with you. So let's move to another question which came up, and it is, what are some resources you use to find jobs in US or elsewhere as a Canadian? And I'll throw it to Mark as he is the one who's been giving out jobs to a lot of people.
Oh man, I know. I mean, it's funny from my personal experience. The job that helped start my career at the time in the U.S. Um, it was obtained through networking. Stephanie, I love what you shared there, Stephanie, about keeping that open mind and learning as much as you can from the people that you're working with, volunteering with. But I would say, any company that you're interested in working for will post their roles. But as we've learned on today's call with Nancy and her example, I mean, some roles are posted just because they have to post it. I mean, in Nancy's case, it was her job that they had to repost just so legally they check the box. So that's where the networking comes into play, is understanding what are the real opportunities here. Where do you see me based on my interests, my skill set? Where can I be most effective in the company? Sometimes we're so laser focused on certain roles or titles in a company or in an industry, but it's people in the industry that can help coach us, guide us, and connect us with teams that will really appreciate everything that you have to bring to the table. That was my case. So, really quick example. I was working at NYU, and I was advising the LGBTQ plus student group there. And they had invited a group of employees from bank to talk about everything they're doing in the LGBTQ plus space. And I thought, this is really interesting. I mean, I've never heard of a bank talk about this before. This was back in 2014. And so I approached the panel afterwards. The panelists introduced me to someone working in D&I. And he said to me, and I mentioned this earlier, he's the man that became a mentor of mine. And he said, keep an eye on the job board. We're always posting roles. So I saw a job for like a senior manager of diversity and inclusion or diversity recruitment. And so I reached out and I said, this sounds perfect. This is exactly what I want to do. And he said, I love your enthusiasm, but it is way too senior for you. Have you seen this job? It was a junior recruiter position. And I was like, I didn't. And that sounds fascinating too. So he helped kind of course correct me in my job search and my recruitment. And that's the job that I ultimately landed. Fast forward 5 years in my career, I'm doing the job that I initially saw on that job board, right? So it's funny, full circle moment there.
Absolutely. More power to you. More power to you, Mark. And I think so. You manifested that the very first moment you saw it, and you have it with you with all the hard work that you put in. I think so. We have time for one more question, and I'll take this to Nancy. Do you believe having a master's degree was necessary for your success in obtaining the US roles? Having a JD and a B already, you still went for another degree. Do you feel like it was necessary for having the success that you had in the US roles?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's not necessary. However, it is one of the avenues, right? So a lot about moving anywhere is about getting your foot in the door. So, having the master's degree meant that I was on a student visa, so I had a reason to be in the country. And then it also, gave me that year to work afterwards. Would I say that, I wouldn't have gotten hired if I didn't have an MBA from the US? No, I don't think it was really necessary. I think it was much more important to opening that door for me rather than, it was completely key to my success in obtaining the role. Other ways you can enter the US, right? L1 visa, do that inter-office transfer. You could marry someone. You could just apply for a job and get a company to sponsor you. Those are all sort of different ways to start working or move to the US. And, getting a master's degree here is just one of them. Is it the easiest or the fastest even? Probably not. It was just, what was right for me, right? So when I moved to New York to start my MBA, I was actually living in Ottawa working for the federal government of Canada. And there was not an opportunity for me to do that inter-office transfer, right? I literally worked for the Department of Canadian Heritage. There were no roles in that department in the US, in New York. So I had to find another private company that has an office in the US. I've had many friends, some of our panelists today who use that route, and it's not necessary to get another degree here at all.
The one thing
Absolutely. And
I just wanted
go
to
ahead.
contextually, because I think, the ask to is like, if I show up in a way that I have additional education behind me, do I become more eligible for to go through, which I think is a very sound question. Something to know is that oftentimes in the paperwork, they will ask you, what is the management structure? How many people will you oversee, or do you currently oversee? And that, in terms of like government language, will also determine how senior you are or how eligible you are for the role that you're seeking to get stateside in the visa process as well. So something, just knowing how to position yourself and what your level of responsibility is going to be is also super helpful, in addition, I'm sure, to the education or not.
Thank you so much. That was a very insightful Q&A session. And thank you to our panelists and our attendees who have had the questions today. So before we conclude, I'd like to ask if the panelists have any words of wisdom they would like to leave our audience with today. Stephanie, as you were the last one, why not go ahead?
Oh, goodness. Words of wisdom. I think know why you want to move internationally or work abroad. It's okay if you're interested because you're looking for an experience that can be short term. And it's also okay if you're looking to make a life change to set you on a new career path. It'll help you feel like you don't have to boil the ocean in making the journey or taking the next steps. And everything is also temporary. The paperwork is a temporary milestone. The discomfort in getting yourself acclimated, figuring out how to work the medical benefits and your social security and how to get paid, and why don't you have any credit in a new country as you're getting a new, it's all temporary and it will pass. So just lean in, go with a spirit of resiliency, lean in on your network, and truly, if you're looking for a short-term experience and come back home, that's absolutely valid. I actually thought that was going to be my journey, but here I am 11 years later and made this my home. But I think we've talked about network a lot, but it will get you through some of the bumps along the way as you chart your next path.
Thank you. Nancy?
Yeah, I think my piece of advice is keep an open mind. You never know where life takes you. I think a lot of us thinking about moving or going to a new country, we're like very type A. We're very structured and organized and intentional about what we want to do. But there are so many things that are just outside of our control. Who's stamping passports at the border, who's reading your letter at the USCIS office, which company or which manager is willing to advocate for you. Just keep an open mind, have everything in life, I think, have like 2 or 3 paths that you would be okay taking, that you'd be open to. And then, wherever you land on one of those 2 or 3, you're going to be okay. I think what can be really hard when you're moving, when you're immigrating, is thinking things are going to happen like 1 and then 2 and then 3. And then as soon as you come to an obstacle, it can be very challenging. But if you know that things are going to be a little windy, it's not going to be a straight path from A to B, you're going to be resilient and you're going to do okay. And then, 11 years later, you'll be just like Stephanie.
Thank you so much. And Mark?
I love those insights and pieces of advice. And I think I'd share some similar ideas. First, completely agree, Nancy. I think, focusing on what you can control in the process is key. And that involves, your attitude, your work ethic, how you show up in your recruitment, in your employment, and also in your networking. I'd say, for me, the network made it. I never would have expected, you know, a couple years after leaving New York to get a phone call from my old manager saying, "We want you back on the team. Do you want to come back to the States?" But I nurtured those relationships. You know, we hadn't worked for 3 or 4 years together, but I kept in touch. I, you know, got to know her family just out of a genuine interest. And, you know, little did I know it would come back in a good way. And then I would also echo Nancy's comment there. You know, it can be a bit of a roller coaster at times for those that are looking to take advantage of, you know, global opportunities or pave a, you know, create a global career. I remember being gutted when I was leaving New York. I thought I'd be there forever. And then I landed in London and I thought, okay, this is the best city in the world. So it's like, you know, opportunities are abound and it's all about your mindset. York University has an incredible student body. Your peers are, in some cases, will be people that follow you into industry and live around the world. I ended up living with one of my best friends in student council in Brooklyn for 2 years together, and never would have planned for that. So don't forget to also nurture the relationships of your peers as well. York, the motto, the way must be tried. So I love it. I mean, like, that's why I'm saying, like, give it a shot. If you're interested in this, give it a shot.
Thank you so much, Mark. And Tantanda Via, as you pointed out, the motto for York. And with that, our event today is concluded. Mark, Nancy, and Stephanie, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and sharing your stories, knowledge, and insight.
Thank you, PS. Thanks, Stephanie and Nancy. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.
Bye.
And to our attendees today, you can join our LinkedIn group or follow us on Facebook by searching York University Alumni, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter as well at YorkU Alumni. Feedback about this or any of our other programming is welcome and can be sent to us on our social channels or at alumni@yorku.ca. The Level Up series will return in 2024. We will be sending details for the next session in the new year. Thank you for all joining us today. We hope to see you all again soon.